Yo, shalom, guys. Welcome to Wisdom and Torah Ministries, and delighted to be back with you today. It's a quick thing that I'm doing today. Let me check here real quick because I want to make sure all of you are tuned in, and I'm just happy and delighted to be with you today. Today is tonight's going to be the first night of Hanukkah, and there's always a lot of misconceptions and a lot of arguments all the time in regards to Hanukkah. So let me give you a little my 2 cents into this, and we're going to be talking about this and exchanging a little bit about it. I hope that some of you would be blessed and some of you will be understand a little bit more about really what this is all about. Okay, now every year during this time, Hanukkah becomes a huge topic of discussion. It becomes a topic of controversy and division and all kinds of stuff. But in reality, the problem is that we're not really understanding its cultural background. The reason why Hanukkah is important. By the way, the word Hanukkah is actually found in the book of Psalms. If we go to the book of Psalms, chapter 30, in the book of Psalms, chapter 30, the word Hanukkah means dedication. So you find that word throughout the Bible in certain places where it says dedication. It says here, a song at the dedication of the temple. So it's a Hanukkah, dedication of the temple. So we need to focus really what the meaning of Hanukkah is. And then, by the way, don't give me the reason that, well, Yeshua was there in the protocol of Solomon, but he wasn't really celebrating, Hanukkah. It's not really a God ordained biblical feast. Well, we all know that. Anyone who reads Leviticus 23 knows that Hanukkah was not actually part of the pilgrimage feast. We all the holy convocations of the Yom Teruah and Yom HaKippurim. We know that. But it's involving the temple. Now, please understand, the Hanukkah is the dedication of the altar based on a particular event that happened during the time of the Maccabean conquest. The Maccabees, they were a priestly family who stood up for the holiness and the sanctity of the temple. They waged war against the enemies and they defeated them, thus dedicating the temple. And it takes 7 days, and it's interesting because every year we have to repeat the same thing for the new people who maybe are trying to understand more a little bit about the Torah, and you keep hearing people who are not studying on the temple. And the key to understand what Hanukkah represents is not about the 8 days of the oil. That's the legend. I mean, people believe it and whatever, but that's the legend. But it's actually the dedication of the temple. You have nine branches of the Hanukkah. No one is worshiping the Hanukkah, candlestick. There is it's a symbol of each day that's lit. It represents each day of the dedication of the altar. 8 days is an official altar. It takes 7 days to dedicate it. On the 8th day is an official altar, and then you have the one that you use to light the others. So it's just the way that it goes. It's only a symbol of what it represents. But let me read to you Second Maccabees chapter 10. Second Maccabees chapter 10. And the issue that I'm having is many people are arguing but they're not considering the temple in all of this. And I think that's what the problem is. So let's read in Maccabees chapter 10. It says, now Maccabees and his followers, the Lord leading them. Guys, Yeshua was there to celebrate Hanukkah because it's the dedication of the house of his father. Any any Jewish person in the first century would have gone up to Jerusalem to celebrate Hanukkah, was to dedicate and to celebrate the dedication of the temple. And I'm going to explain that to you. So let me get this straight. We do not want to celebrate Hanukkah because it's not in the Bible, but yet God led the Maccabees to retake the temple to dedicate it. All right, so let's continue. It says, they recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars that have been built in the public squares by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary. That's the essence of Hanukkah. They made another altar of sacrifice. That doesn't happen in one day. Okay? Then, striking fire out of flint, they offer sacrifices. After a lapse of 2 years, they offered, give me one second. They offered after a lapse of 2 years, they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrated and implore the Lord that they may never again fall into this misfortune, but that if they should ever sin, they may be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened that at the same day in which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day, on the same month, which was Kislev. That starts, I think, tonight. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing. They celebrated 8 days with rejoicing. Take 7 days to dedicate the altar, and then on the 8 days an official altar, but also they celebrated with a rejoicing as if they were celebrating Sukkot, because for 2 years they were not allowed to celebrate Sukkot. Okay? This really isn't a liturgy. There isn't one liturgy that tells you how to celebrate Hanukkah, because it's not a pilgrimage feast, but it's a dedication of the altar. Thus, it's very important to remember this. It says, they celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of Booth, remembering how not long before doing the festival of tabernacles, they have been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy, red wands, and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offer hymns of thanksgiving to him who have given success to the purifying of his own holy place. Now, this is a part. This is a part. This is the reason why every Jewish person does this. Okay? Watch. It says, they decreed by public edict, ratified by vote. That's by the men of the Sanhedrin Council. This is by the judicial court in Israel at the time of the Maccabean conquest. That means it is a national holiday. Okay? It's not doing away with a feast. It's not trying to take the place of a feast. It's a national holiday to remember a particular historical event. The whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes. Okay? So there's a reason as to why we celebrate Hanukkah. Instead of everyone arguing and debating as to why we do that and why it's a Jewish thing and Yeshua was not there, let us stop that nonsense and let's start really studying the core matter here. I've been telling you for years, the issue on the common denominator is our lack of understanding on the temple. And we're making the same mistake again. Every year, people are attacking the temple of God because they're focusing on the noise instead of looking right to what we're focusing on. What is the function of the holiday? Or in this case, the day. 99% of all Hebrew roots people, they just celebrated Thanksgiving, and that's okay. But we cannot come together and celebrate the day in which the house of God was rededicated and sanctified and purified. That's not okay. That has to be a point of controversy. Well, you were eating your turkey last week, and I had some turkey that was delicious, because it is a national holiday in the United States, and I respected that because it doesn't go against the Torah. It has no controversy with the Torah. No one is worshiping the turkey. No one is doing prayers to the underworld. How can we not celebrate Hanukkah as a celebration of the dedication and its true meaning, purification of the temple, to thank God for the victory over the enemies? But instead, we attack one and then we observe the one from this nation. But we want salvation, redemption, and purification from the God of Israel, but we reject the things that represent the holiness and sanctity of his house. It is time for the kingdom to start understanding what holiness is in the context of the temple. It's not an argument. When we understand its context, it's never an argument. It's actually a correction. But the problem is that we are seeking and we're looking at the context of what modern day secular or modern day Orthodox or secular Jews do. They do the dreidel. They do the legend of the oil, but many of them know it's the rededication of the temple. Many people object to the giving of gifts. That you don't have to do any of that stuff. You don't have to do any of that stuff. But at least celebrate the dedication of the altar. Celebrate the purification of God's house. Remember that in adversity, remember that in persecution and oppression, there was a remnant that stood fast, stood in front of the line and said, we will preserve the holiness of God and we will not go after the gods of the nations. Because right now, many people are going back and saying that, hey, Christmas is all good. There's nothing wrong with it. I'd rather keep celebrate Hanukkah and stand for the holiness of God's house than mix the holy and profane or the sacred spaces. So therefore, I don't really care what people do with Christmas. I only focus about Hanukkah. Christmas is irrelevant to me. To me, it doesn't. It's not any. It's just another day that means no meaning to me, and I'm not going to observe that in any way. It has no connection with Yeshua. It has no connection with Messiah. But Hanukkah has a connection with Messiah because Yeshua was in the temple celebrating the dedication of the temple, the remembrance of the dedication of the temple. Yeshua was there participating on the commemoration of the time of the victory over the enemies and oppression and persecution. When the Greeks used to make the women who circumcised their children wear the children, dead children, hanging them by their necks because they're circumcised. Anyone who will read the Torah, they will kill. Therefore, these people that dedicated the temple, who fought against a greater army, who stood by the holiness of God, we deserve to remember their valiant and their stand for righteousness. If anything, more than ever today, we have to have the Caleb's and Joshua's or Judah Maccabees who will stand up and say, as for me and my house, we will worship God. And like he said in Maccabees, those who stand for Torah, follow me. So I make the rallying cry tonight. Those who stand for Torah, follow me. Not just me, but everyone who follows Torah. And let us stand again for the holiness of the temple, for the righteousness of God. Let us stand together to defeat the enemies in persecution and oppression. Right now we have a so-called brand new variant of the virus. More than ever, we need to stand as a kingdom. Listen, if you took the vaccine or not, it's not my problem. I don't really care if you took it or not. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's your problem. But it should not be about taking the vaccine or not. It's about whether or not we're going to continue to be allowed to be pushed, take away our freedoms, because the same persecution and the same oppression that happened in the time of the Maccabees is being repeated today. And right now we need an army of Judah's Maccabees and his brothers that in the time of the city of Modi'in, they stood up and they built an altar in that city. And there were some people there from the Jewish people who were willing to compromise the truth and the covenant of God to go after the ways of the nations. And these people stood there and said, we will not go the ways of the nations. Today, more than ever, we need a kingdom who will stand for what is true, for what is right, for what is righteous, for what is holy. And instead of us wasting time arguing about whether or not Hanukkah should be observed or not, why don't you just study the meaning of it and what this represents? Once we understand what it represents, we should all observe it. Because there were those people who stood for what was right. They could have gone the way of the Greeks, but they chose not to. And they paid with their lives in order to stand for God's righteousness. Who of us is going to do the same? Who will stand and say, we will not go the way of the nations. We will stand for the covenant. We will stand for the land. We will stand for the people. We will stand for the Torah. We will stand for the temple. And we will stand for God. And we will defend the honor of his son, Yeshua the Messiah. It is time, ladies and gentlemen. If you never really read a lot about history, it's time for us to get a real crash course. Because in all the times there's been oppression throughout history, it always ends up being the fault of the covenant people. It always ends up being persecution for those who fear and hold fast to the covenant. Now more than ever, we need to learn from our forefathers. Now more than ever, we need to understand what those men did to stand for righteousness. Because if we don't have an army of righteous people, the world will overcome us. And no weapons formed against us shall prosper. So Israel, be stand in awe. Israel, please stand up. Israel, please gather your shield and gather your strength and decide to stand for what is right. Stand for the covenant. Stand for the people. Stand for the God of Israel. And we will never lose. Just like the Maccabees, a minimal army, they defeated a greater foe. Today, we can do the same if only We stop arguing about the holy things and learn and understand really truly what is important for our own spiritual walk. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Thank you for joining me. It's a really quick word for you. And if you want to know more, go to wisdomandtorah.com and, don't get offended. This is truth. Never going to apologize for stating the truth. It's time for us to stop arguing about stuff, do the research, and understand that there's a meaning for things in the Bible. And the day of the day of Hanukkah, celebration of Hanukkah, should be an observance for everyone who believes in Yeshua. Because if it was good enough for Yeshua to be there, why is it not good enough for us? Shalom.